believe that man is on the point of an evolutionary leap to a higher stage.
So you keep all your books in sheds.
Yep.
These are what you've been collecting for the last 50 years.
Yeah, and this is a more or less complete collection of all my books. And then we've two more similar collections in different rooms.
And these are all the books that you've written?
Yeah.
And how many have you written?
I don't know. I've never bothered to count them. There must be about 150.
The first one being The Outsiders?
Yeah. Yes, that came out in 1956.
And it's still on sale?
Yes, still in print.
Still in print.
And these things are all the crime collection, which I've had to split because I've got so many of them, and half of them are in the other top shed.
What's the latest book?
The latest book, I guess, is the sort of science fiction book I'm working on at the moment.
You have a working title for that?
Do I not? Usually, the title is usually the last thing I think of.
Oh, really?
But one of my early books, a thing called The Mind Parasites, was partly a takeoff of H.P. Lovecraft, which I wrote for a friend of Lovecraft's. And then this latest thing, I'd always decided that I would like to do a similar thing of a 1930s American science fiction writer called Stanley G. Weinbaum, who died young. And so this latest one I'm doing is in a way my own tongue-in-cheek version of Weinbaum.
Right.
And, you know, so uses some of Weinbaum's ideas, but his basic... Weinbaum invented a nutty professor called Van Manderpootz, and in 4 different stories he invents completely dotty, wild things. Well, I've created my own Van Manderpootz, and he also, invents really wild, dotty things. But I've gone to the heart of his invention, which is really mind control, and what he is interested in is what we were talking about earlier, getting the understanding what the mind is capable of. What is done is to discover that in fact the brain appears to have a rhythm which hadn't been discovered before, a thing called sigma rhythms. Alpha rhythms are about the slowest rhythms in the brain, about 8 megahertz. The sigma rhythms, which he's discovered, are sort of much lower than that. And what happens is that when you tune into the sigma rhythms, they bring a state of such complete deep peace and relaxation that you see and understand things that you're not normally capable of. So that was the idea behind the book.
Like it, yeah. It's got a basis in reality as well.
Oh yes, yes. All my books, particularly the kind of science fiction things, have got a basis in reality.
Would you care to tell us about just the sheer volume of work that you've managed to do? Is it Shaw? Is it inspiration? Do you love it? Is it?
Well, it sounds like an enormous number of books, but if you actually think about it, Phil just pointed out to me that it amounts to around about 3 books a year, and 3 books a year doesn't take all that long to write. I mean, Anthony Trollope reckoned that he wrote 1,000 words per day, and you know how many shelves his novels occupy. So if you work out that 3 books per year is just possibly 300,000 words, then you can see that you only got to write for 300 days a year, and you've written 300,000 words. And so in fact I'm lazy.
Well, I mean, by your standards perhaps, but it's as much as most other people can do just to get the pen and paper out. I mean, do you have many more plans? Do you wish you could have written more?
Well, possibly, although I've written quite a lot of books simply because a publisher commissioned them and I needed the money, which is the story of most writers. But in some cases, for example, an American publisher called Random House, said would I write them a book about the occult. This was the time when it was all becoming fashionable, and sort of around about, I can hardly remember the date
1970s.
now. 1970, yes. And I agreed, convinced that I was going to write a lot of nonsense that would be sort of tongue-in-cheek and how many unbelievable things you can believe before breakfast. But when I settled down to writing the book and to doing the research on it, I was amazed, that I was totally convinced by it. I said to Robert Graves, I'd been asked to do a book about the occult, what would you advise? And he said, don't. But it would have been very bad advice if I'd taken any notice of him, because in fact it was an opening to all kinds of interesting new things. And for example, we all know that it's impossible to know the future. And yet, I quickly discovered a number of cases in which there can be no doubt whatsoever that somebody or other saw a very, very clear vision of the future. And when I'd come across a number of these completely contradictory things, I thought, my God, I don't understand it. But quite clearly, human beings have some mental capacity that goes beyond anything we understand, in our everyday lives. And then I realized that in a way that has been all my life's work. That's been the kind of thing that interests me, because I'm not now simply speaking about the occult and paranormal. I'm speaking about the fact that when as a teenager, whose intention was probably to become a scientist, and I was intensely miserable when I went back to school as a lab assistant to take a BSc. I hated the whole business. In fact, came pretty close to suicide at one point. And then I got terribly interested in poetry. And it suddenly struck me that this was a completely different world, that when I felt terribly miserable, I would start off by reading extremely miserable poetry, things like Edgar Allan Poe's For Annie and things like that. Thank heavens the crisis, the danger is past, and the awful illness is over at last. The fever called living is conquered at last, and so on. And then I would move on to, as it were, more cheerful poems like T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. And eventually, within half an hour, I was reading sort of things like Milton's L'Allegro, which is the absolute converse of that. In other words, I moved myself from a mood of total depression into a mood of optimism simply by reading poetry. And so I realized that there's a curious alchemy concerned here, that you could be carried away completely by the world of imagination. Then it struck me that one of the things that had always fascinated me was the fact that during the 19th century there were so many suicides among men of genius, suicides and people going insane and this kind of thing. And so I then began to feel there's a kind of secret hidden here somewhere. A change came over the human mind at a certain point. In fact, I was able, later on, thinking about this, to pinpoint the date of that change. It was the year 1740. And what happened in the year 1740 was that a printer called Samuel Richardson, who who was writing a kind of book about how to write letters, suddenly got an idea for one or two letters that seemed so good that he thought, I won't waste these on a do-it-yourself book. And he went away and wrote this book, which was letters from a servant girl who was writing to her father about the fact that now that her mistress was dead, the new young master had said to her, don't you worry, Pamela, I'll look after you. And she said, she could hardly believe in her luck. Then, of course, from then on, the new young master did his best to get her into bed. And the book he then wrote, called Pamela, was the first bestseller. I mean, just swept across Europe. And why? Because everybody was anxious to find out whether Pamela actually did lose her virginity. And it was an immense success, but more important, people discovered that when they began to read Pamela, particularly women, what happened was that they had got onto a kind of magic carpet that would carry them off into a world of imagination, and they suddenly spent hours in this world of imagination. Now, it hadn't happened before that. People just did not have that much imagination.
What was it that drew you to the dark side, for want of a better way of putting it?
Well, what was it that drew me to the dark side? I don't know, in a sense that I look upon the subject of the paranormal, of the occult, as a dark side. I'm aware, that it can be interpreted that way, but in fact, it seems to me that it's basically a revelation of all kinds of interesting things about us that we weren't aware of. I mean, for example, if somebody genuinely was able to foresee the future with great accuracy, then obviously it could be extremely useful, as it was in this particular case, I quote, in the occult, in which a mother who was out in the garden with her little daughter suddenly had an absolute conviction that she had to get the daughter indoors, and in fact a few minutes later the train went off the embankment, crashed down on their garden and would have killed her daughter. So she had a very, very clear knowledge of this. Now, if you want to know what I think is the answer to that, it'll sound rather wild and weird. I believe, I've come to believe it, years of looking into all this, that there is such a thing as life after death. And I also believe that after death, there is no time. The result is that people who are dead know the future. And then with them, if we really have this capacity to know the future, then all that has happened is simply we've been able to plug in, so to speak, to an ability that the dead already have.
Do you have an opinion on why people have such polarised views about this matter? Because it seems to me that there's very little middle ground. There are, well, I encounter many people who are just flatly not interested in what they would call religious or occult nonsense. And then at the other extreme, you have either people who subscribe to it without questioning it, or men like yourself who have spent decades looking into it and they clearly find there's something of value there. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground where people just generally discuss it. It seems to be all or nothing.
And that's simply because most people belong, as it were, to the ordinary physical world and can't really be bothered. And I understand this perfectly well. That seems to me to be a perfectly good point of view, not being interested in it. The fact remains that I do get rather angry with certain sort of so-called scientific people who say, oh, the whole thing's absolute total nonsense, when all they mean is they've been too lazy to really study it and look into it. Because almost anybody who studies and looks into it ends, I'm pretty sure, like me, totally convinced.
But there's this all-pervasive point of view, and it's, again, I think it's becoming prominent these days with the arguments about creationists against science. And so many people, in my experience, seem to believe that if a scientist pronounces upon something, then that's the end of the matter. There's no argument involved.
Except that you can still be an idiot as well as a scientist, and that unfortunately is true of a huge number of scientists nowadays.
Surely not. I think Arthur C. Clarke said something along those lines as well.
And he's what I would call an idiot, yes.
You were not impressed by Arthur C. Clarke?
No, because he started off by saying, oh, well, I'm a total skeptic about all these things. And then, of course, ended by making a television series in which he took great care to stay on the sceptical side of the line. But you can see that he's simply being dishonest. And I've got the feeling that that applies to a great many so-called scientists. You see, this business of life after death, I was asked to write a book about the poltergeist. And like most people, I assumed that the poltergeist is a manifestation of the mind of disturbed teenagers who could cause all kinds of weird things to happen. You know, objects to fly through the air and that kind of thing.
I have your book, by the way.
And I was then asked to go and have a look at a place in Pontefract where there was a poltergeist haunting. The poltergeist had smashed every bloody thing in the house, every cup and glass and plate. So Joy and I went off to Pontefract, and on the way we stopped at a place in Derbyshire where they were having a sort of meeting, and I attended it and gave a lecture. And then a man called Guy Playfair came along. Now, I had been in correspondence with Guy, knew that he knew a great deal about all this, and therefore I hung on because we were supposed to be getting a move on to Pontefract. And when Guy came, I said, you know, we're just going to investigate a case in Pontefract of a poltergeist. What do you think poltergeists are? And Guy said, well, they're basically, I forget what he said. they're footballs. I said, they're what? He said, they're footballs. I said, what are you talking about, they're footballs? He said, well, the thing is, you see, when people get emotionally disturbed, they leak energy, particularly sort of, you know, unhappy people. He said, and the energy tends to take the shape of a football. He said, you know, it's an extremely light kind of quality. I said, well, what happens is that you've got a house that's full of invisible footballs. He said, a couple of spirits wander past the window, see there's lots of footballs in there, they get in and proceed to kick them around with great pleasure because they can actually use this extremely light energy and smash things. So I said, wait a minute, you're telling me that poltergeists are spirits? The guy said, oh yeah, sure, they're spirits, all right. I said, you know, well, I always assumed they were due to the energies of disturbed teenagers. Oh, no. He said, some are, I'm sure, but you know. So anyway, when we left, he said, and when these footballs explode, they turn into water. So when we left, I said to Joy, poor chap is as mad as a hat. So we reached Pontefract, went along to this house where all this stuff had taken place, and when we said to them, well, how did the whole thing start? They said, it was most peculiar, these sort of pools of water kept forming on the floor. And the more they told me about it, the more I saw Guy knew all about it and I knew nothing about it. And it was quite obvious that, in fact, you know, then the daughter of the house, a nice teenager called Diane, told me how she'd been dragged upstairs by this force, what's more, with a grandfather clock or a grandmother clock lying on top of her. And I said, weren't you frightened? And she said, well, no, oddly enough, I wasn't. She said, but it left great bruises on my throat. Well, when I thought about that, I thought, you know, a girl who's dragged upstairs by an invisible force, yet somehow does not feel frightened because somehow the force is partly coming from her. And then I suddenly realized, yep, Guy's right, poltergeists are spirits. And what had happened in that house in Pontefract was basically that it had been built on the side of a gallows centuries before, and it would seem to be haunted by a kind of ghost of a monk. Anyway, that convinced me that poltergeists exist all right. There were several years later when I was asked by a publisher to write a book about life after death. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I don't really believe in life after death. And I thought, hey, wait a minute. You know that poltergeists exist. You know that poltergeists are probably dead people. So you do believe in life after death. And the more I thought about this, the more I saw that it all connects together. But it connects together in a way that completely denies what we regard as, ordinary physical normality.
You've got a nice 2 acres here in sunny Cornwall.
Yeah.
And you've been here since?
We moved into this house in 1959.
Never wanted to leave?
No, until we heard that they were building below us, and then, we couldn't find anywhere satisfactory anyway. Just look at this, like a jungle. Believe it or not, this is the first time I've seen this. Our property more or less finishes with a deep ditch on the other side of those trees between us and the next field. And we once actually found some kids had set up a camp in there.
Have you been to many haunted places? And the reason I ask is that I've been to a number myself, and whether they were haunted or not, they fascinated me because of the atmosphere to them. I'm wondering if you've done anything similar.
No, I've never actually taken any trouble to study haunted places. A girl who was my secretary did, because she was naturally a good medium. She went along and studied these with another friend of mine. But I'm absolutely convinced that there are hauntings. I'm absolutely certain too that hauntings are basically caused by dead people who don't know they're dead. And that if you can actually persuade them that they're dead, they sort of give a great whoop of delight and vanish. Do I mean that therefore there are never negative forces, the things you were referring to when you said about the occult? Well, no, I don't mean that, because I'm absolutely sure that there are really some pretty nasty things out there.
On which subject, you've written a great deal about serial murderers. It seems to be a perception amongst younger people these days. They only see the celebrity of these people, whereas I assume that most of us, when we get older, we're aware of the sheer horror of what these people do. I mean, because you've looked into it seriously, how taxing did you find it as subject matter to write about these men?
I don't find it at all taxing. I've always been deeply interested in this question of why people do it. I have, in fact, become acquainted with 2 or 3 of different periods, but the one I really got to know was the so-called Moors murderer Ian Brady, who in the early 1960s, and together with a woman called Myra Hindley, murdered a number of children and buried their bodies up on the moors of Yorkshire, which is why he's known as the Moors murderer. Anyway, this girl who turned up here once at 3 o'clock in the morning said she wanted to write a book about her correspondence with Brady, and could she quote Brady's letters. I said no, she couldn't, because they were his copyright. I then got a letter from Brady saying, was it true I was helping this girl to write a book about him? So I replied, no, I wasn't. She was writing the book herself. But anyway, the result of this was simply that in the way that prisoners with nothing else to do are glad to get into correspondence, Brady began writing to me. And I took the opportunity to sort of find out what I could about his view of the Moors murders and why they'd been committed. To begin with, I was inclined to treat Brady as if he was a decent, reasonable, honest sort of person, because his letters showed that he was quite an intellectual who had done an enormous amount of reading. Lord Longford said that he appeared to know Tolstoy and Dostoevsky better than most Russian scholars. But then it became quite clear to me that there was another aspect of Brady which I hadn't taken into account, and that was the fact that there was a kind of childlike, nasty temper about him. He really, was a child who loves his own way. I discovered this when I dropped Brady a line saying, Joe and I have got to go to Egypt for a couple of weeks and we shan't be back until sort of mid through next month. One of the first things I did when we got back to England was simply to send him a postcard to this hospital he's in Liverpool, saying, okay, I'm back. And this crossed with a letter from Brady to me. He'd assumed that because I hadn't written to him for a fortnight and he hadn't noticed that I'd said we were going away, he sort of exploded with rage and said, would I return all his letters to him and all the rest of it. And then of course my letter arrived the same morning his letter arrived here, and obviously he was thoroughly ashamed of this, and he wrote back to me and said, oh well, no harm done. But this explosion was absolutely typical of him, and as I got to know him better I realised that he was that sort of a person. That is to say, he was the sort of a person who was totally spoilt, and if he felt like exploding, he exploded. Didn't realise that it's often a good idea to control yourself and not to. And this was clearly the reason that he'd committed these murders. He'd been quite influenced by the works of the Marquis de Sade, and Sade of course says that anything that's purely natural is therefore forgivable and okay, including murder. And Brady had more or less taken this to heart, and although he now disowns de Sade completely, nevertheless what we corresponded about, and we corresponded for about 10 years, was mainly questions like that. In fact, I sent him the complete works of de Sade, which they didn't mind him having at all in the prison.
You mentioned about his familiarity with Dostoevsky and such like, and it seems to me that there's a myth about some of these men that they're super intelligent, and I've read quite a bit about Ian Brady, but would you describe him as genuinely intelligent as opposed to well-read or cunning?
Well, I helped Brady finally to publish a book, because I saw that this was one jolly good way for him to get a lot of these things out of his system. One very perceptive reviewer remarked, Brady is certainly clever, but not half as clever as he thinks he is. When he got into arguing about whether it's wrong to commit crimes and so on, he would say, society commits crimes all the time, and then quote to me the Americans dropping napalm and killing children and all that. And I would say, yeah, the problem is that two wrongs don't make a right. I agree totally with you about the napalm. I don't agree with you that therefore if society commits evil, you've got a right to go out and do it yourself. it was quite obvious that this was a point he just simply did not pick up.
It's a matter of retreating into philosophical abstractions.
That's right, yeah.
One question. What, did your association with Brady harm you in the public eye, do you think?
Oh, I don't know, because I never taken any notice of what I wrote various articles about Brady in the Daily Mail, who paid tremendously well, but whether they actually did me any harm, I don't know, because I merely sort of told the truth as I knew it about Brady.
Who is the person you would most like to have chewed the fat with? Rasputin, Cesare Borgia, Alexander the Great? Does any character come to mind?
Not Cesare. The problem with all of those, particularly Cesare Borgia and Alexander the Great, is that they were undisciplined people, whereas I have always had a total obsession about the idea of mental discipline. And when I've got to know criminals, I've always seen that the real problem with them is a certain lack of mental discipline. I've got a feeling that, if there's such a thing as salvation for human beings, it lies in mental discipline. I mean, the people I've admired most have been other writers. For example, Henry James, the American novelist, once struck me as probably one of the greatest novelists of all time. It's an opinion I no longer hold, but did for quite a long time. Now, I would have liked very much to have met Henry James. Right, and then T.S. Eliot, as among modern poets, I admired greatly, and probably he was an enormous influence on my work. And I did meet Eliot, and in some ways got to know Eliot moderately well, because we were trying to get out of jail an American poet called Ezra Pound. We were both working on this. But the answer to the question is, Eliot was an extremely limited person in many ways mentally. I mean, his total conversion to the Church of England is an example. I can't think of anything less likely than me joining the Church of England.
Would you care to tell us a bit more about you and T.S. Eliot trying to get Ezra Pound out of jail?
Oh yeah. Pound, of course, was put in jail simply because he was regarded as a traitor, having gone to Italy during the war and stayed there. But basically, of course, he was just a kind of innocent. And a poet called Ronald Duncan, who was published also by Faber and Faber, that is by T.S. Eliot, knew Pound quite well, exchanged a lot of letters with him, and we therefore, the two of us, began to get a stable of people together who would help get Pound out of jail. We even wrote to Winston Churchill, who gave us a very dusty answer. But then when I suggested this to T.S. Eliot, Eliot said, we are already doing our best to get him out of jail, and really it would probably be best if you soft pedaled this, because he intimated things were happening, and indeed one day at lunchtime in the court, when all the reporters had gone away to lunch, the question of Ezra Pound came up. Very quietly, without any fuss, he was released from jail.
Anthony Burgess, you met him. Do you have any printable thoughts on the man?
Anthony Burgess, the novelist, is rather interesting. Is that he is, as far as I know, the only person about whom his biographer wrote a violent attack. The biography of Anthony Burgess is basically an attack on Burgess, saying what idiot he was. And although Burgess and I got along quite well, because I went to Mallorca with my family for one winter, and Burgess was also a writer in residence there, and of necessity we got to know one another pretty well. I always felt that he was an immensely conceited man, and the sort of man who wanted to be sort of regarded as knowing absolutely everything. And I felt that this touchiness of his meant that in a sense, we didn't really get on ultimately well together. In fact, he did a very nice piece about me in the first volume of his autobiography. The second volume of his autobiography, which came out, I think, after his death, had an extremely vicious and nasty piece about me in it. And this doesn't surprise me at all.
And why was that?
Well, the reason I think he wrote a very nice piece about me was that I'd reviewed his autobiography very favourably, the first volume, which I thought is a very good book. And he was one of these kind of literary people who, you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And then, but he realised, that basically, fundamentally, we just do not agree. I mean, he once told me that he suffered from free-floating guilt. It's quite apparent that, there was something badly wrong with him. He had this kind of thing. And of course he said he was a Catholic, or he'd become a Catholic to deal with this free-floating guilt. Well, since, I've never in my life been bothered by free-floating guilt, we obviously had fundamental things not in common. I mean, this sounds a terribly conceited thing to say, but I think Anthony was basically jealous of me. When we were in Mallorca, they had a quiz in which, our students were answer the questions and so on, and I was the master of one team and Anthony was the master of the other. It cannot have been a coincidence that my team beat his team. And also, he claimed to know an enormous amount. The truth was he was a know-all rather than, questions like who wrote Mozart's 37th Symphony and so on. Instead of, as anyone who knows anything about music would have replied, well, Mozart didn't write a 37th Symphony, he got it wrong. And so he felt, that I'd set a deliberate trap. So no, it's a pity. As you can see, I'm a rather friendly sort of person. I tend to like people. And I would have been perfectly happy to continue together. And I always regarded Anthony as a friend. Until after his death, I came across this second volume of autobiography with his vicious attack on me. Most people who say no, they don't believe in God, like Dawkins, are idiots who don't know what the question means. If you said, do you believe that the universe has a basic purpose? I'd say yes. And that, in a sense, is, saying you believe in God.
So do you think that it's an intelligent purpose?
Yeah. I think the universe has an intelligent purpose, and I certainly do not believe, as most extreme Darwinians do, that it's just a brutal free-for-all. I also believe that our minds, on a very deep level, can influence what happens. In other words, that our destinies are to some extent within the control of our own minds. So obviously, I'm not by any means a kind of philosophical skeptic in that sense.
But you don't necessarily go along with any religious doctrine that man's created?
I don't think so, no. In my teens I came very close to joining the Catholic Church at one point, but then made the mistake of going along to some priest for instruction and decided after one session that he was such a bloody idiot I couldn't stand anymore. But the reason I went for instruction was the feeling, the belief that the Catholic Church still had monasteries, and that what I really wanted to do was to go into a monastery and turn my back on modern society, the outsider syndrome. This is Joy's work shed. But and most of these sheds contain sort of sets of people. And for example, there's almost complete Sartre and Camus and Hemingway.
Oh wow!
And that kind of thing.
You have how many books?
Well, I worked it out once that I've got about 150,000. But that's only a rough count based on actual shelf space, assuming that so many feet of shelf contain so many books.
So you've had to build extra sheds onto the house.
Yeah, so that's the reason this shed got built, as another library, and then the same with various other sheds that have got built at different times. That thing you've just been looking at, my crime shed, was when we first moved in we had a boat, and that was the boat shed, and then we decided we needed the space for books. This is just another library shed which we decided we must build simply because we had so many books.
It's incredible.
Yeah, so that's the poetry collection at the back there.
Over there.
All of the volumes on UFOs, which I accumulated when I wrote a book called Alien Dawn.
Ah, that's a very famous book, that.
Alien Dawn, yeah, a good book, I think.
Yeah.
I think probably one of the best books written on UFOs.
I agree. It's one of those seminal kind of books that everybody's got to have who's interested in UFOs.
Yeah. Yes, it covered it pretty well completely. This is all biography. In alphabetical order. And that, oddly enough, is kind of show business biographies, which I've accumulated as time has gone by.
It's one of the things over the many years that you've been writing, you must have met an awful lot of very famous people, these celebrities.
I suppose so, yeah.
Because I mean, you rank amongst them.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, I suppose so. Not that celebrities ever really interested me.
No.
I don't think I ever met any really interesting ones.
No? Nobody like Noel Coward or anybody like that was really...
No. Noel Coward and I saw one another in the Athenaeum Club when I was there having lunch with some old guy who said he could tell me the identity of Jack the Ripper.
Right.
And he was sitting at the next table. But the old guy's account of Jack the Ripper, he was the one who thought that it was the Duke of Clarence.
Right.
Which of course I've written up.
So do you know who Jack the Ripper was then?
Well, no, I think that I've changed my mind once or twice. There was a period when I thought it was James Maybrick, the sort of Victorian who got poisoned by his wife, probably.
Yeah. Right.
But I've changed my mind since then, simply because the American the serial killer team decided that it couldn't be that sort of a person, and since they probably know more about serial killers than anyone else I can think of, I decided to drop this idea about it being Maybrick.
Clearly, you've been a very well-known man for decades now. Would you care to tell us where the transition came from Colin Wilson, who perhaps had dreams of writing or whatever, and how you started on the path to the man you are now?
Well, in a sense, you see, I had tremendous luck in that my first book was an overnight success and literally catapulted me to fame, so that I woke up as one critic once said, like Lord Byron, already famous. But before that, it was a sort of really pretty long, hard struggle, because I was born into a working class family in Leicester. My dad was a boot and shoe operative who never at any time during the 1930s earned more than about £3 a week. So there just wasn't much money around. Although Leicester, unlike Nottingham, did sort of fairly well in trade. And of course, I was, I guess, from a very early age, the kind of intellectual of the family, in that I was an obsessive reader, and the things that fascinated me to begin with were things like astronomy and science. And then my mother bought me a chemistry set for my 10th birthday, and I became wildly enthusiastic about chemistry. And so I started off as an enthusiast about science, and all I really wanted to do was to become a scientist. And I had had dreams about becoming the new Einstein. And then when I was 15 at school, I realized that I'd got to start thinking about the future, because my parents couldn't afford to send me to a university. And so what was I going to do? And of course I tended to sort of drift along in the way that most people do. When I left school, my old headmaster said, look, there's a job here as a laboratory assistant if you want it, but you'll need another credit in maths. So he said, you'll have to take the maths exam again. So I really settled down, worked like mad, took the maths exam and got the credit, and went back to school as a lab assistant. Well, although that sounds wonderful, a step in the right direction, actually it turned out that I hated it, because during that time between leaving school and then going back to school again about 2 or 3 months later, I'd become fascinated by poetry and by literature in general, and I'd really started doing some really wide reading, including on philosophy. So I was sort of pretty unhappy, and this was the period when I started reading poetry and sort of daydreaming, and the time when really I began to think about this great mystery of the time when human beings began to dream about sort of other times and other places, and that absorbed me so deeply that when I went back to work as a lab assistant, science just no longer interested me. The person I had become most deeply interested in was the writer Bernard Shaw, and he seemed to me, quite honestly, the greatest writer that the West had produced, and I still tend to feel that, rather. I have this enormous admiration for Shaw. And so for a long time what I was hoping is to write plays and to become known in that way. Well, I had to work away at school as a lab assistant. Although I totally lost interest in science, I suddenly thought, this is just a bad joke, why do I put up with it? And I thought, all I have to do is to pick up that cyanide bottle on the shelf, on the reagent shelf, and take a swig, and in sort of 5 minutes I'll be dead. So I decided one day that that is what I'd do. And I went along to the chemistry class that evening, the class in analytical chemistry. When I went in late as usual, they were all grouped around the professor at the desk. I went along to the shelf, took down the bottle of potassium cyanide, took the glass stopper out of it, and as I lifted it to my lips, smelled that distinct cyanide smell like bitter almonds, and then quite suddenly had an extremely clear vision of the next few seconds of an intense pain in my stomach, and I suddenly caught the bottle up and put it back and thought, what are you doing, you silly fool, you don't want to die? And this cheered me up enormously. Anyway, from then on I realised that what I really wanted to do was to get more life, not less. And so I stayed at school until they realised I wasn't interested in science anymore and sacked me. Then at the age of 17, I became a civil servant in the Leicester branch of taxes. Hated that just as much because it was just sitting around in a boring office all day long. Then, in those days, you had your period of national service. So when I was 18, I went into the RAF. And for a while I found that quite enjoyable because, of course, training particularly meant that I was no longer sitting around mooning and doing nothing. And so I became much happier. But then, once I settled down in the RAF, the job they gave me was a clerk in an auxiliary unit, which only came in at the weekends. They were, in other words, they were part-time soldiers. I must confess that I was tremendously subject to boredom in my teens. I realised that it was something that I had to learn to get rid of. Anyway, I finally got out of the RAF by accident. The adjutant had given me a letter to type out, and I'd made a bit of a mess of it as usual, and he came in and said, Wilson, aren't you ashamed of yourself? And waved this thing under my nose. And something in me revolted, and I said, no. And he looked rather stunned, and then told me to go and wait in his office. I must confess, tempted to pick up an inkwell and throw it at him as he came in. I thought I might as well do it good. But anyway, to my surprise, he was quite sympathetic and said, "What's the matter, Wilson?" It was then an idea occurred to me. A friend I'd had throughout quite a lot of my teens was a homosexual in Leicester. And I said, well, I just feel hopelessly like a fish out of water. He sent me along to see the medico in the unit, who himself turned out to be a homosexual, and who completely bought my story that I was homosexual. Well, all that I'd intended was to get myself, an agreeable job. I didn't want to get out of the RAF. To my astonishment, I found myself out on my neck, which was really wonderful. Because, of course, the question is, what was I to do? Now I was out of the RAF, back sort of in civis, and the RAF didn't even realise, the civil service didn't realise that I was out, and therefore, in a sense, I ought to go back into an office. I suddenly thought, no, never again will I go back into a bloody office and put up with that kind of boredom. It suddenly struck me that the answer would be to become a tramp. So that's what I decided to do. I saved up enough money working in labouring jobs to, make a little, just about enough to give me a start. And then off I went, sort of more or less tramping the roads, sleeping in haystacks, this kind of thing. I found it was a much harder life than I'd expected, because of course there's no rest for you if you're sleeping in a haystack, and the feeling that you might be disturbed at any moment. Anyway, for quite a long time I did this. I actually then took a boat over to France. Went to see a pen friend that I'd corresponded with in Strasbourg, and was there for a while. And then finally got fed up with that and came back to England. The problem was what to do next, continually. What I did was to go and take a job in a great big chemical firm in Leicester called Richards, and there I met a nurse who was 9 years my senior, and I sort of I was quite attracted to her. I used to go around to her place, and she'd give me sort of tea and biscuits and all that kind of thing. Anyway, the long and short of it is we finished up in bed, and she got pregnant. And when I told my parents that, she'd got pregnant, they were sort of quite shocked, particularly when I said that she intended to have an abortion. And they said, no, you've got to marry her. So I got married, rather to my disgust, at the age of 19. And it didn't work out at all. Didn't work out, not because we quarrelled or, simply because in the time we were married, which was only 18 months altogether, we had 8 different homes. The problem is that no landlords wanted babies. And so, it made life very, very difficult. And finally, we separated simply because we couldn't find anywhere to live together. I then sort of went to working in a factory, and it was after a while of that I met Joy, and persuaded Joy to go to London with me. By this time I'd been separated from Betty for nearly a year, and we simply never came together again. The most amusing story was that we went along to a party at the publisher Faber and Faber, which was T.S. Eliot's publisher, hoping to meet Eliot, and but in fact T.S. Eliot didn't turn up, and so we went and piled into a taxi, and as we were passing the new Watergate Theatre near the Haymarket, we saw this giant crowd around the theatre, so we told the taxi to stop and went and inquired what was happening. It turned out to be the first night of a play by Arthur Miller called A View from the Bridge. And then when I saw that I happened to know the leading actor in the play, Anthony Quayle, who was a neighbour of mine in Notting Hill, and that I knew the producer, I went around to the rear of the theatre where a giant crowd was waiting, and said, Anthony Quayle's dressing room, and they said number 3. We went down there, and the dressing room was jammed with celebrities, including Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, and of course Arthur Miller, and Marilyn Monroe. So I met Marilyn Monroe, who seemed a sort of, quiet, rather shy sort of person, and actually Vivian Leigh dragged me off to talk to me. She was a nymphomaniac, and made it fairly clear what she had in mind. And left Joy talking to Marilyn Monroe. I said afterwards, what did Marilyn Monroe have to say? So she said, she was more preoccupied with her dress, which kept slipping down over her tits, and she kept grabbing it, heaving it up. Anyway, we later on did meet Marilyn Monroe when Arthur Miller and I and a couple of other people did a thing on a debate on the stage of the Royal Court. I could tell, actually, this sounds very conceited, I could tell that Marilyn Monroe was attracted by me, and I'm sure that the reason was that, of course, I looked a bit like Arthur Miller, with my glasses and all the rest of it. And as we were leaving the theatre, we had to sneak out of the back door of the theatre in a line. Arthur Miller was sort of one of them, and next to him was Marilyn, and the next person along the line was me, and Marilyn grabbed my hand very tightly and held it until we got out of the place. So I've always been able to say, well, Marilyn Monroe held my hand. And anyway, as we left the theatre that night, some reporter said to me, what have you been doing? And we told him that we'd gone to this party hoping to meet T.S. Eliot, and met Marilyn Monroe instead. And the story, as it appeared in their gossip column, was that I'd gone to this party hoping to meet T.S. Eliot, and that I'd met Marilyn Monroe instead, and that I was so drunk I couldn't tell the difference. And that was typical of the kind of gossip column stuff that came out. We actually both got pretty sick of gossip columns and everything to do with them.
Colin Wilson making a cup of tea. How cool is that? Do you know how many lives you're actually making right now? We can all die happy now, Colin. Managing to film Colin Wilson making a cup of tea.
captured before.
This is a scoop. And here we have Dennis and Frank.
It is.
Dennis has very kindly come to interview Colin for us.
Well, pleasure's all mine, it really is.
Frank's a druid. You're a druid. So we've got a druid and archaeologist, and a man who's written 150 books.
This will sound pretty awful, but I had always been absolutely convinced throughout my teens that I would be the major writer of the 20th century, and that, you know, the only three names in English literature would be Shakespeare, Shaw and me. And Roald Dahl once said to me over dinner, you know, well, we have to confess you and I are just sort of nobodies who sort of churn out stuff that'll be forgotten. I said, no, I don't think so. I think I'm probably the greatest writer of the 20th century. And Roald looked quite upset. He didn't like to hear that kind of thing.
He was a fascinating character himself, though, wasn't he?
Well, yes, he was. And we got on very well simply because I wrote to him to say, can I quote a story of yours about wine in a book I wrote about wine? I said, how much would you want to charge? You know, quote a chunk of it, and he wrote back and said, I wouldn't dream of charging a fellow writer. You quote what you like. And so I did, and the result was I asked him out for a meal together with his wife, and who was a film star, and they'd met in Hollywood and so on. And we all got on tremendously well together. And in fact, it was Roald who suggested to me that I ought to write a fantasy novel, as a consequence of which I wrote what I think is probably the novel by which I may well still be remembered in the distant future, a huge thing called Spider-World, which is as long as The Lord of the Rings, and which I think, you know, is one of my most important books. But unfortunately, by this time, the sort of this prejudice which had really got started with all this silly publicity was by then so powerful that nothing I could do could change things. And so in a way it's been sort of swimming against the current, but on the other hand, since I love my home and love writing, and I've written, you know, so many books mainly because I wanted to, because it's something I've thoroughly enjoyed doing, so I can't really complain. And here am I shall be 80 in 2 years' time, and you know, what I would love to do is to live to be 300, as Shaw suggested ought to be possible in Back to Methuselah.
And other books that you've done that are collections of historical mysteries and such like, and I thought they were just absolutely first rate. I really enjoyed them because to me they were treasure troves, and I couldn't begin to fathom where you had dug up all this information about these arcane subjects and such like. So, you know, from a personal point of view, I thought those books were wonderful as well. I know they perhaps don't fall into the category of the others that you're talking about, but would you like to tell us something about that, about exploring the subject matter for these kinds of books?
Well, books like that tended to be potboilers, but to begin with, in 1960, I wrote the first encyclopedia of murder. And this was because I'd always been fascinated by the subject of crime, because my grandfather told me that he'd been a child in Whitechapel at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. And this fascinated me because I've got a book lying around the house somewhere called The 50 Most Amazing Crimes in the Last 100 Years, and at the head of each article there's a picture of the criminal, you know, sort of like Crippen or Seddon or whoever. At the head of the Jack the Ripper article there was just a huge black question mark. And so I was fascinated by it, and I began exploring everything I could about Jack the Ripper. I came across an article in a little magazine called Titbits that was very popular at that time, and the head of the Salvation Army said in this article that he was convinced that Jack the Ripper was a bloke who'd been his secretary. And actually, a friend of mine who was very interested in Jack the Ripper has tracked down the article and the whole story. But anyway, this was why I decided, when I was when The Outsider was out, and I'd done my second book, which had been murdered by the press, as I say, I decided I would like to write an encyclopedia of murder, because no one had ever done it before. You know, if you wanted to look up some particular murderer, you just had to look through kind of fat anthologies of things with title like, you know, Only the Gallows Ahead, and that kind of thing.
Well, I presume that living in Notting Hill at that time as well, you must have been familiar with Christie.
Yes, absolutely, with the Christie murders. They were, of course, in 1953, which was way before. But I then got to know quite well Francis Camps, who was the doctor who helped to take the bodies out of the cupboard and examine the corpses. And he told me various interesting things. And, you know, so once again, I was quite fascinated by the whole business.
And when was it you met this man?
Oh, Francis, I don't know, probably when The Outsider was out, 1956.
I presume by this point, Colin, it may be stating the obvious, but you'd long lost the sensation of boredom that you complained about earlier.
Well, yes, because once you're trying to write for a living, of course, you've no time to be bored. You're just sort of working on like mad. And then, of course, Joy had 2 more children, 2 boys, and so I got a family to support. But I always found that subjects for books came to me very easily indeed. I mean, one day I was looking through a play about Rasputin, written by some sort of writer about 40 years ago. I suddenly thought, I would really like to write a book about Rasputin. And so I settled down and did the research. In fact, Rasputin's daughter, Maria Rasputin, later wrote to me and said she thought that was the best book she'd ever read on her father.
Oh.
So, you know, all of this research was really worthwhile. And also a great many myths I was able to disperse in my book about Rasputin. And the fact that almost everybody else who'd written books about Rasputin before that had just more or less quite ruthlessly invented, and I was able to prick these bubbles one after another. I always remained fascinated by the question, you know, of killers and why they do it, which is why when Ian Brady wrote to me out of the blue to ask whether it was true that I was helping a girl write a book about him, and I replied no, it wasn't true. Nevertheless, we continued in correspondence and stayed in correspondence for about 10 years. So I got to know a great deal about the Moors murders and, you know, the motivation behind them.
I mean, I presume, again, this is stating the obvious, but I mean, it seems that you've done so many things in your life, Colin. It seems as if there's been never a dull moment, you know, what with horsewhipping, serial murders, holding hands with Marilyn and Monroe and such life. I mean, do you find this mental application invigorating? Do you find that it's, you know, physically enriched you in any way?
Oh, I don't know. I suppose if I look back on it, then I think, you know, what an interesting time it's been. But you see, I've always been preoccupied with the notion that, and I heard myself saying this one day when I was giving a lecture to the Shaw Society in round about, I imagine, 1960, I heard myself saying, I believe that man is on the point of an evolutionary leap to a higher stage. And I thought, you know, afterwards when I thought back on this, I thought, did I really mean that, or did I just kind of say it, you know, on the spur of the moment, as you do when you're lecturing? The more I thought of it, the more I saw that not only is it true, I didn't mean it, but in a way it's the key to my whole life's work. I'm absolutely convinced that man is on the point of an evolutionary leap, and that in a sense something is about to happen to the human brain, as it were. It's almost as if a kind of time fuse had been set in the human brain, which at a certain point changed everything completely. Now, I knew that had happened once in the 18th century, at the time when Samuel Richardson wrote his novel Pamela, and this had changed the sensibility of the whole of Europe. Quite suddenly people had discovered that, they enjoyed sitting in an armchair with a book and floating off on this magic carpet into other people's lives, because that's what it amounted to. Before Samuel Richardson's Pamela, people, when they had nothing else to do, read, believe it or not, volumes of sermons. I could see that this had occurred once in history after Samuel Richardson, and that it caused an enormous change, because what it brought with it was this whole movement we now call Romanticism, and sort of Byron and Shelley and William Blake and all that kind of thing. And in other words, it had set the tone for a complete change in the intellectual history of European man. And so this fascinated me to begin with, because of course the question the outsider had started with was, why do so many men of genius commit suicide in the 19th century? And since I myself felt that I was labouring under the same burden as so many writers of the 19th century, there was I, sort of working class boy in Leicester with no chance of getting to university and so on, forced to try and do it all on my own. I realised in retrospect that those years of struggle, and they really were struggle, were in fact quite good for me, and that they left me feeling much stronger and much more able to become a real writer. That's the reason that The Outsider was written so quickly and easily, because I'd been preparing for it for years. I'll tell you another thing, by the way, that's worth mentioning. I'd started at the age of 16 to keep a journal in a kind of ordinary, school notebook with cardboard covers, and poured my ideas and frustrations down onto paper. This taught me to be a writer. Gradually, I stopped writing like a schoolboy and began to write like a grown-up, so to speak. And so whenever people say to me, how do you become a writer? I say, well, the first thing to do is start writing a journal. That's the most valuable thing you can do. And so I felt in a way that I'd been preparing for this whole thing for years. By the time when I wrote The Outsider, and The Outsider almost seemed to write itself. There's an experience I had that convinced me of this. The experience was this. 1989, I was lecturing over at a place called Sheepwash in Devon to a largish group of people on New Year's Eve. And that evening it began to snow, and it snowed and it snowed and it snowed. It snowed so heavily that the farm was in the middle of the countryside and the farmyard was down a slope. And so that when we wanted to get out, we couldn't, because we couldn't get out of this slope that was completely covered in snow. Anyway, it just so happened by total chance that my car was the only one that actually would grip the snow and get up the slope. I managed to get out of this place after 3 days being stuck there, driving back to Cornwall. Well, it was a very, very difficult drive, because the road was only as wide as these roads around here. In other words, for two cars to get past one another would have been very difficult. And I didn't know where the ditch was, because it had filled with snow. So what I could see happening was, I'd skid and land in the ditch. And then I'd somehow, and these were the days before mobile phones, have to get through, on the nearest phone and get myself heaved out by the AA. Well, I continued driving, in other words, with total focused concentration, because I didn't dare to let it go. And I drove like that for hours until I got back to the main Exeter Road, where the snow had been churned up by passing lorries into mud. then, as I was able to relax on the main road, I suddenly found that a very peculiar thing had happened to me. Suddenly, everything was deeply fascinating, as if some peculiar light had been turned on, and everything I looked at was fascinating. If I went past, let's say, I don't know, a tree or a lamppost or a tiny village or whatever, I wanted to kind of look over my shoulder with the feeling that it was so fascinating. And that state of deep interest and fascination, which I saw, I'd created accidentally by this intense concentration on not going into the ditch. That this was a change of consciousness of a sort that I'd never expected. That I'd achieved a new level of intensity and consciousness. And what I've been trying to do ever since then is to recreate this. And I finally reached the stage of being able to do it. You know, so that even if, for example, I take the car and drive into Truro to go to Tesco's, I can concentrate like mad on the way there and get myself into this state of mind and actually feel, you know, a kind of heave, like your car being stuck in the mud, and suddenly, you know, the wheels come free. The most interesting insights of my life came when I received a letter from an American psychologist called Abraham Maslow. And what Maslow said fascinated me. He said that as a psychologist, he got sick of studying sick people, as Freud did, because sick people talk about nothing but their sickness. And being a cheerful sort of person himself, he decided that he would study instead happy people. And so he went around asking various people, who's the happiest person you know, and got a list of these people. Then he went and met them and quickly discovered something that nobody else had ever discovered before, because nobody else had ever thought of studying healthy people. And that was that all of them had, with a fair degree of frequency, what he called peak experiences. They were just sudden experiences of sort of wonderful happiness, you know, bubbling over. And, for example, a young mother was giving her husband and kids breakfast when suddenly a beam of sunlight came in through the kitchen window, and she thought, my God, aren't I lucky, and went into the peak experience. A chap, Marine, who'd spent years in the Pacific without seeing a woman, came back to base, saw a nurse, and went into the peak experience because, he said, he suddenly realized women are different from men. He said, we don't normally recognize this, we take it for granted, until suddenly it hits you, as it hit him. And he says they're absolutely as different from men as horses are from cows. Well, these are typical examples, and as soon as he began talking about peak experiences to his students, they began describing peak experiences that they'd had and that they hadn't really noticed at the time. And so, for example, one of them was working his way through college as a jazz drummer in some obscure little basement. And one morning, at about 2 a.m, he suddenly found he could not do a thing wrong. He was drumming absolutely perfectly. And as that happened, he went into the peak experience. And then, another student said, yes, I can cap that, and told a sort of similar story of the same sort. Well, Maschler then noted an interesting thing. As the students began to talk to one another about their peak experiences, they began having peak experiences. And what's more, once they'd got used to talking about the peak experiences with one another, they began having peak experiences all the time. In other words, having peak experiences was simply a matter of thinking and talking about them. And, you suddenly realize that there is, as it were, a form of consciousness which is, quite commonplace, or ought to be, and that we don't really notice simply because we've got so used to taking it for granted. And a man called Richard Morris Buck in the late 19th century was sitting talking with a group of friends, among whom was Walt Whitman. And he got so absorbed in the poetry they were quoting to one another and so on, that when he left the place he was in a tremendously exalted, happy state of mind. And in the carriage that was taking him home, he suddenly noticed a kind of red glow in the carriage. He thought, what's that? It's fire somewhere. And then when he looked more carefully, he realized, no, it wasn't in the carriage. The fire was inside himself, giving him this overwhelming feeling of sheer happiness. Well, from then on, he began to collect examples of other people, Walt Whitman, for example, who'd had this same experience, and that had carried them into a level of wild happiness. Now, Maschler himself found, as I say, that people could have these experiences by simply thinking about them and talking about them, and as soon as you began to take it for granted, something, as it were, inside you relaxed. And once this something inside you had relaxed, then quite suddenly you were in a state in which peak experiences were exceptionally easy to come by. Anyway, this fascinated me in itself because ever since I was a child, I've always been inclined to have sort of experiences of great happiness. I noticed them as a child particularly, at Christmas time, as all kids do. And that everything seemed quite different at Christmas time, and so on. And then later on, when I discovered chemistry and various things of that sort, once again, I'd be carried away completely and totally into a sort of, not really an ecstatic state, but something like that, into a feeling that everything was more wonderful than I thought it possible that it could be. And I called these states holiday consciousness, because they were kind of consciousness that you got when you were setting out on holiday, and suddenly, as you're bowling along a country lane or something of the sort, you've suddenly got this feeling of, my God, it is a wonderful world, isn't it? And I think that, in fact, if you could induce these states of mind we're speaking about at any time, you would get this sort of feeling that the so-called bad things there seem to be are not particularly important. You see, this business of sudden wild happiness strikes me as so interesting because it's in a way so close. There's only a paper wall between what we call our ordinary consciousness, which tends to be slightly pessimistic, and this feeling of total happiness and relaxation. Now, I thought I'd stumbled upon one of the basic causes of it when I learned about this difference between the left brain and the right brain, and the fact that in patients who suffer from brain damage, sometimes an operation is done on the brain that separates the left and the right, and that such people then become literally two people. And this is because we've actually got two people living inside our heads. And you could say that one of them is living in the left side of the brain, and the person who lives in the left side of the brain is you. And he takes life pretty sort of seriously, and basically is a pessimist. The person who lives in the opposite side of the brain is a kind of non-you, and it's quite obvious that the right side of the brain is the side that contains all kind of inspiration. Now, in these people we're talking about, it's perfectly obvious that, you know, these peakers have actually simply discovered the trick of tripping that right side of the brain. You see, all writers know that it's a hell of a bloody job to develop the discipline to become a writer, and that you write something and you think, aha, that's pretty good, and the next morning you read it and it's shit, and it's almost as if, you know, it's dissolved away on the page. But this sudden plunge into a different state of consciousness fascinates me, simply because it seems to be the answer. You see, when, as I say, a writer is struggling away with something, but he refuses to let go, keeps worrying it and keeps at it, and then suddenly gets this feeling of total breakthrough, and then suddenly realizes how very close this is. It was there all the time. And what seems to happen is that it seems to depend upon an odd kind of relaxation into the right brain, as if you'd already got all of the ingredients there for the peak experience and just hadn't brought them together properly. Now, that's the thing that fascinates me so much. You see, when you are working like mad at something, it's almost as if you've got two tennis players inside you, whacking the ball back and forward between them, between the right and the left brain. You know, the poet suddenly gets his inspiration and all the rest of it. This seems to come from the right brain. But as this sort of inner tennis match is going on, or you could almost compare it to two lumberjacks at the end of a double-handled saw doing this. And when suddenly something seems to happen in which the game of tennis gets absolutely perfect. You know, as I've said, these people said he couldn't, when he was drumming, he just couldn't do a thing wrong. Everything was perfect. Now, what I believe is that we have this odd capacity to do this, to slip into this state of mind in which everything seems to change simply because somewhere deep down inside us we know where this is. We know how to do it. And once you've discovered this and realize that it's quite close, that you suddenly realize that this tennis match between the two halves of the brain is not all that difficult to get going, and that once you've got it going, as I did when I was driving from Sheepwash that time, concentrating like mad, all that had happened is that I, by sheer discipline, had concentrated myself into a state in which suddenly this perfect tennis match between the right and the left was taking place. Now, once you realise that the two halves of the brain are there anyway, and this tennis match could take place any time, you suddenly realise that all you have to do is to actually know that it exists, and that you're only one step away from it. Now, if that is true, then it's going to make a major change in our civilization as people begin to recognise this. You see, weirdly enough, I appear to be about the only philosopher alive today who is basically optimistic. And I'm basically optimistic simply because I've come to recognise this, recognise it to begin with because of, you know, sheer effort and misery in my teens, and then the realisation that if you grit your teeth and push hard enough, you break through the misery, and quite suddenly the tennis match is taking place between the two halves. It's also like that game you sometimes play, you know, as a child, where you have to go absolutely straight, stiff as a board, and then you let yourself fall backwards into the arms of a friend who's waiting behind you to catch you as you fall. But you must have that trust that your friend actually is there waiting to catch you. But you must believe that the friend actually will catch you. And once you have this absolute trust that the friend will catch you, then suddenly it's a fairly easy thing. And I'm actually writing a novel at the moment, which is basically about this, about a scientist who gets terribly interested in what he describes as sigma rhythms in the brain. Sigma rhythms don't really exist, but alpha rhythms are these the most basically relaxed rhythms we know, and you can bet when poets are writing poetry, you will find alpha rhythms. But in these states we're talking about, these states of sudden relaxation and happiness and peak experience, I'm pretty sure that we go into a state of relaxation which is much deeper than the ordinary alpha rhythm. That if you could actually generate an electroencephalograph that would measure your brain waves in such a time, you would discover a slower type of brain wave than any we know at the moment. And that the people who can get into this phase, this is what I call sigma rhythms, suddenly have this absolute certainty that it's all fairly easy. Now, the reason that I've discovered this was simply that I have noticed that whenever things seem to be going very badly and very dangerously, you can, simply by switching yourself into this, go into this curious deep state. And I've described several times, for example, how once when I was in Cheltenham with Joy, on our way driving back to Cornwall, and we got Sally with us, who was then a little girl of about 3, and we went into a bookshop that I always went into in Cheltenham, and, you know, got a pile of books, and Sally got bored and said, you know, where's Mummy? And I said, oh, she's just outside. And I took her outside the shop and showed her Joy, who was only about 5 yards away, with the boot of the car wide open, making room for the books she knew I was going to buy. Sally trotted off to her. I went into the shop, and then Joy came in, and another 5 minutes went by before I said, where's Sally? And she said, I don't know, she was with you. Without instant panic, we both rushed out to the street, and it was the rush hour in Cheltenham, and the street was crowded with vehicles roaring in both directions. I went one way and Joy went the other, and we came back again, and still we hadn't found her. Well, naturally, you know, we'd never, since she was a baby, been without her. So we were in quite a state. We were afraid she'd step off the pavement, you know, in front of a bus or something. But anyway, the next time Joy came back, she went right around the block and found Sally wandering around the pavement there. She came back and we got into the car and drove off. And I suddenly realised that I'd gone into this curious state of ecstasy, what I call sigma rhythms, in which I was thinking, my God, isn't exhaust smoke a pleasant smell? And aren't buses beautiful objects? And this state of absolute total happiness, and the realisation that, of course, this was there all the time, if only I could go into a deep enough state of deep relaxation.
I mean, do you think Nostradamus was an apocalyptic poet? Do you think he was a seer, a mixture of the two?
He was undoubtedly a seer, and undoubtedly had this peculiar ability to suddenly see the future. But the way that this worked in him, I just don't know. I think he actually went into a kind of state of this deep inner relaxation through staring into a candle flame, and when the state of relaxation was on him, suddenly he knew all kinds of things, which came out in the rather complicated form of the quatrains. One girl, the wife of a professor, at a class of mine in a girls' college where I taught in America, was talking in America, and talking about what I've more or less been saying now, about grounds for optimism, said, How can you be optimistic in a civilization with plastic kitchen tiles?
Joy, what was it like as a young lady finding yourself in the public eye, being hounded by the press and such like?
Well, I can't say I enjoyed it, and it made me very prejudiced about journalists for a long time. And they were nothing like they are nowadays, when they really hound people, or seem to. But at the same time, we actually, the ones we were with, who, when we had to do this sort of, I think Colin have told you, a flit across England and into Ireland, were absolute charmers. They were really nice people, but it was their editors and people who seemed to cause the bother, and we had one or two family upsets as a result of all this, which, you know, I think it could have been handled better, really. And it took me quite a long time until I began to see the journalist point of view and so on, you know.
I mean, it must have put a bit of strain on you at the time. I mean, did you have second thoughts, thinking, this isn't the life for me, I can't see another 20 years of this?
Well, I think when you're young you don't think anything's going to last that long, you know. It's always going to be something new coming along, so I didn't really think in those terms, but I did kind of take cover when journalists were at the front door. I used to slide out the back and so on.
I mean, and what was it like, conversely, away from the unpleasant side of it, you know, meeting people like Marilyn Monroe and such like?
Well, I enjoyed all that. Yeah, it was very interesting, and usually they weren't what you expected, you know. I thought she'd be very flamboyant and so on. She was, in a way, a bit retiring when I spoke to her. We met her a couple of times when she was over with The View from the Bridge the play was on with Arthur Miller's play.
Did you like her?
We liked both of them, yes. I liked her, yes. I was surprised, I didn't think I would, but she was quite a sight in that she was dressed in this beautiful red velvet dress, you know, which had literally been sewn onto her, and she was in the middle of this dressing room adjusting it in front of the mirror. And the room was full of people like Vivien Leigh and Laurence Olivier and so on in the back of the theatre. It was a comedy theatre, I think. She was quite oblivious to them, and she was just adjusting her appearance in the mirror and chatting to me in a quiet sort of, you know, friendly way.
I mean, were there other people that you was surprised at how they were, what they were like? People like Laurence Olivier and such like.
I suppose, in that in that case, he was smaller than I thought, but actors often are smaller than if you've seen them, you know, at a distance either on the stage or the screen, they often appear larger than when you meet them in the flesh. And Vivien Leigh the same, where she was small, well, you would expect her to be fairly petite, I think. But, as for writers and poets, they were most, I suppose they were people we met most. They all had their own personalities and so on. Which
was there anyone that you particularly liked that perhaps Colin wasn't fond of, or vice versa?
No, I don't think. I think on the whole we tended to agree on whether you know, what people were like. I mean, we approached them from the same sort of angle in a way, and perhaps were critical of either critical or non-critical along the same lines. Otherwise we would have been fighting amongst ourselves, I suppose. I think that in those days literary people had more of they seemed to have more of an interesting personality, whether it was that their lives had been they were more mature perhaps, the writers we met. People like Eliot and so on. I mean, there was he had his definite personality. And
what did you think?
You know, which of course emerged into his work. And a lot of the poets and so on, like Louis MacNeice or John Lehman, who ran a magazine there, and then we met people like UNESCO from France, and that was quite interesting. And
Robert Graves?
Robert Graves, yes, we spent time with Robert Graves on Mallorca, and got quite friendly with him. He was very good, very interesting person. I'm reading his book now, again, Goodbye to All That, about the First World War, because I'm studying it. But he never mentioned it was there, but you could tell he'd been a soldier. Although he was quite a flamboyant poet in his way, he had that kind of, and that's the sort of thing you would see people's experience came out in their, in their everyday personality.
I mean, do you find it pleasing to look back at having met people such as this? Because when I was speaking to Colin earlier, in this day and age, we are talking about the winners of reality shows and such like, who I doubt will be remembered in 40 years' time, but you're able to talk about people such as Robert Graves, Marilyn Monroe, Laurence Olivier and such like, who by any standards have stood the test of time. It must be pleasing, or I presume it's pleasing for you to think back about these people that you used with, and
yes, I'm glad we had, I had the opportunity. I mean, I didn't really earn it. I think Colin did, but I mean, I was just lucky to be in that at that time, around at that time, I think.
So you did think it was lucky after the incident with the horsewhip and such like?
Yes, all that horsewhipping business. Well, I mean, it was at the time. It was in a way, I think the attention was drawn to us because there had been one or two other elopements at the time, which caused it. Nowadays it wouldn't cause any kind of interest at all, but at that time it was. I think James Goldsmith ran off with some South American millionaire's daughter or something at that time, and that caused great scandal and so on. And then after that, somehow in the wake of that, our unfortunate episode came up. So they were looking for that sort of story. And nowadays, of course, there's no news in it at all. There's no point in running away, is there? Unless I suppose there's a lot of money involved.